I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Penny Walters, who I first met April last year down in Bristol, a Federation of Family History conference on the subject of ethical dilemmas. But on this case, because Penny was adopted, she was telling us about her own experiences and the nature of that and what that had really revealed about the ethical dilemmas of researching adopted individuals. She's traced her family back, her birth family back to Ireland. She has been lecturing for over 30 plus years on the psychology and business studies throughout the UK. She has a PhD in ethical dilemmas in health promotion and has a postgraduate certificate from Strathclyde in genealogy. She also is the proud mother of 6 children who keep her very busy, I'm sure. And they have all taken their DNA tests, and they have all been very interested in discovering that their cultural heritage was not the Caribbean and Jamaica as they had hoped, but all the way back to Africa. So her whole family are committed to the subject of genealogy, I feel. She has also taught internationally, globally, intercontinental. We've been having lots of debates about it, but she's shortly going to go to Brigham University in Salt Lake City to speak. She has also published loads of articles in terms of ethical dilemmas, psychology of searching, combining DNA results with the paper trails, and Irish heritage, Ivory Coast ancestors, and the one that fascinates me most, which I must talk to her later about, is census taking in Egypt. She's recently published a book called Ethical Dilemmas in Genealogy, and I'd like to hand over to Penny, and you're in for a real treat.
Thank you. Hi, so my name's Penny Walters, or is it, if I'm adopted? I thought this was a really snazzy title, The Psychology of Searching and Ethical Dilemmas in Genealogy, so I thought that was quite snazzy. So, my story is probably quite typical of everybody in the room. I started off researching family history because I really love photographs, and I've still got that love of photos. I find black and white photos the most interesting. Also, as a little girl, I used to really enjoy listening to stories from elderly relatives, and I used to listen to my parents' explanations for many things, including squeezing the bottom of the toothpaste and being quite frugal and never throwing any food out and recycling everything from my parents. My dad always used to get really upset when he spoke about World War II, so very sadly, and it's the regret of everybody in the room, that you didn't ask your grandparents more of these questions. So I missed out quite a lot of World War II stories because my dad was upset and I wasn't 100% interested in that. When I had my first baby, when I was about 25, because I'm adopted, that was actually the first relative that I'd ever met. So if you can think about that for a little bit. So everybody probably in this room has met their relatives. You know your parents, you know your brothers and sisters, blah, blah. But basically, the very first biological relative that I ever met was my daughter. So I was absolutely shocked and flabbergasted with a variety of things about this baby, not just the fact that I'd had a baby, it was that this was my first relative. When I looked for many hours, I don't think I slept for 3 days, I kept looking at her little toenails and her little fingernails and her little ears, and then it suddenly dawned on me that somebody 25 years earlier had sat in a hospital bed looking at my little fingernails and my little toes and my little ears, and I started to wonder where this person was. So I obtained my original birth certificate, and something that I hadn't understood at all when I went to the interview by the government to see if I was actually allowed to get this piece of paper was that I'd have a completely different name. So I didn't understand that at all. So I just went in the room, was given a certificate, and then a whole new person emerged. My children also had to do trees for family school projects, and my mum was an absolute mine of information, and she would write everybody's life story on the back of photos, and she'd have your name, address, your date of birth, a variety of relatives, your street, and what colour knickers you were wearing on the back of every photo. So in actual fact, my tree, which is here, I was able to go back quite far because my mum was such a mine of information. But sometimes when I was looking at that tree, I felt that it wasn't actually my tree really, because I was adopted, although I was fond of a variety of relatives. I joined Ancestry in 2010, but I didn't really understand it. I just stuck a few relatives on a tree, and then over the years I've worked out the possibilities and the tools. And randomly, at Who Do You Think You Are in 2015, I walked past a DNA stall and bought a DNA test, which I didn't understand either, but I get excitable at these events and buy loads of books and bought a DNA test. So I didn't understand at all, really. I was never very good at biology or physics and chemistry at school. Anyway, so I then started collaborating, which is the posh word for gossiping, with my DNA matches, some of whom came from America and one from Australia. So I've met all these talking for England, gossiping kind of people. I don't know where they've got it from. So there must become some kind of DNA thing for talking too much. But anyway, so because they were filling in my gaps, I devised my narrative. So basically I made up a story about myself, designed on my family tree and designed with the collaborating that I'd done my DNA tests. So I basically made up my story. I started giving talks about adoption because my DNA was Irish heritage, so the brown hair, the blue eyes, and a bit beige. When I went to Ireland, I found that I looked like everybody, and then I hadn't looked like anybody where I lived, so that was exciting. And then I took the online postgraduate certificate in genealogy at Strathclyde, and now I lecture about a variety of topics. So that's a similar story to most people in here, in that you've started off with photos and family stories and then ended up telling everybody about your tree. So why do we do genealogy? So this is actually a philosophical question. So if you look at philosophy, philosophy is about asking questions and psychology is about answering them. So philosophy is the study of nature, the causes, the principles, reality, knowledge, and values based on reasoning. And in my opinion, if we look at the symbol for philosophy, I think you've got probably a phallic symbol there and a lady symbol. And definitely when you look at the psychology symbol, you could argue that that was a womb. And if you look at a lot of symbolism in Renaissance art, there are a lot of chalice figures and symbols with wombs. So I thought that probably if you looked at the symbols for philosophy and psychology, they did relate quite well to genealogy. So when I'm chatting fascinatingly about my family tree, my friends just roll their eyeballs around their head, and my children say, "Why are you looking for dead people?" So my children have got no interest whatsoever in their family tree. They were absolutely fascinated by their DNA results, which we'll talk about a bit later, but generally they've got no interest in their family tree. Because I came from the frugal World War II child family, basically we were always trying to recycle things, and those family stories were quite vibrant. I think in a generalization, but as a mum, I feel it's true. It's quite a throwaway society now. So if your television breaks, you get a new one. If something runs out, you get a new one. So in that sense, my children live in the present and aren't that interested in their family tree. So I'm just wondering, whilst we're here in the room, what is it that makes us, as a room full of people, so interested in our ancestors and our relatives? Because we're actually genealogists and family historians. We're not actually archaeologists digging up dead people. So apart from Richard III, we're not archaeologists. So when I was doing Google Images searching for this talk, I found this one called, which I've I just Googled searching, and I liked this image, so I've put this up as one of the examples for my talk, The Psychology of Searching. And one of my teenagers was wandering past and said, "What are you doing, mother?" And I said, "Oh, I'm doing Google images for one of my talks." And he said, "Oh, are you only looking for one person?" Which I thought was an interesting metaphor, because I'm actually doing my family tree, and whilst I'd put in a Google search for an image for searching, the searching Google image did actually come up with this, and my child pertinently said, "Are you just looking for one person?" And I thought, no, I'm not, I'm doing my tree, but as an adoptee, maybe deeply, I was actually just looking for one person. So there's quite a lot of messages in that one picture. All cultures and all religions have impressive recorded lineages. So if we look at any religion or any culture, if we look at Christianity, Islam, Egyptology, people have always got a very impressive genealogy ready, and therefore perhaps we are trying to contextualise ourselves in these people's great ancestry, their great civilization and their great culture. So there's always a great prestige with tracing our families back quite far in time. I'm always very impressed, but a bit concerned about the amount of time they might have taken when people say they've got their family tree back to 1272 or 1580. I always think, oh, that sounds really impressive. But then I think, crikey, it takes me every hour I'm awake, and I've only got a few generations back. But basically, if you are going to feel very proud of your ancestors' prestige, and we heard this morning about their accomplishments, should it be that whilst you are proud of your relatives and your ancestors' good things that they did, and you feel that you've inherited those traits? So if you had a kind of warrior suffragette grandma, or you've got somebody that was really powerful, or they became a single parent with 12 children during the famine, you know, if you're going to feel very proud of certain ancestors, should you also feel some shame? So if you do find mass murderers or people that have committed hideous crimes, should you feel some shame as well? And therefore, should you have to accept some responsibility in your DNA? So whilst you're proud that you've inherited something off your dad and you've inherited something off your grandma, and you feel really proud of those things, I'm a warrior because my grandma did such and such, should you also be able to incorporate some shame that has come upon the family, and does that get passed down in your DNA as well? There are implications for that. So, whilst this is the Guild of One Name Studies, I've tried to add my examples related to the audience. So basically, surnames have only really been introduced to the UK after 1066. The Norman barons introduced surnames, obviously around the Domesday Book, and the point of putting names was that the government wanted to know how many people were in the country, or what they were selling, or how much they were doing, and how much tax. So if you lived somewhere else, you wouldn't have surnames. There'd be no need at all. So surnames, as you guys will know, originated from occupations, where you lived, your father's first name, or your appearance or disposition. So sometimes when we're researching ancestors, we can find some quite quirky names, and some of them make you shudder a little bit now, for some of the nicknames that people have got as surnames. So traditionally, people just live in a community and everybody knows everybody. So if you live in a small village, everybody in your family knows the people that live a little bit further away in the same small village. So there wouldn't be any real need for surnames. But obviously, in order for you to prove that you are justifiably allowed to have that title or that power or that land ownership, pedigrees started getting constructed, whereby people would have it recorded for general viewing that basically you were entitled to this power, or you were entitled to the land, or you were entitled to that title. So the average person didn't have a family tree as we know it now. So I think that there is now a shift from family trees being quite exclusive. So I think the original purpose of doing a family tree was to kind of prove your background, whereas I think that now we're getting a bit more collaborative with family trees, and actually we are including quite fragmented pieces of society. So rather than the elite lived like this, and the elite wore those clothes, and the elite had that land, you've now got, in my instance, the average Joe Bloggs who woke up in the morning, literally, worked really hard in a field all day, had 12 children and then died. So I haven't got one single interesting story from my biological tree. They just woke up, worked really very hard and died. So in that sense, those people would never get recorded in the history books. So those little fragmented ag labs aren't recorded anywhere apart from in my tree. So there's a huge interest now in compiling family trees. So it's gone from being an elite proving who you are kind of thing to the average person is doing it. It's a really interesting hobby. You can now access records on the internet. Some people started their family trees because of a trigger event. So somebody might have died in the family and you thought, oh, I didn't realize they were going to go so soon. Sometimes we feel that older age is approaching, and if you haven't published loads of books and you're not a pop star or somebody famous, you can start worrying that in a couple of generations people will have forgotten you. So when you feel your older age is approaching, you might want to start writing it down, and those kind of stories are absolutely fascinating. And I always encourage friends to ask their elderly relatives to write their life history. They're fascinating stories. Some people do a family tree because they were fragmented from the family, in my case, adoption. Some people just want their own personal background context. We want to leave a legacy for our descendants. There's a huge surge in television programs. Most days now, you can watch Who Do You Think You Are or Long Lost Families. The DNA testing adverts are satirizing the television, so every time I turn on the television there's a DNA advert encouraging me to look for my ethnicity. So these adverts have quite saturated now, it's quite normal, and the word DNA testing is part of our household words. But obviously some adoptees might feel forced to search. After watching Long Lost Families, people will say to me, are you going to do any of this kind of research, Penny, if they didn't realise I already had? And perhaps sometimes I think it could be argued that whilst we are doing all this research on the internet and we've got the social media, actually the word social media might be a bit of a misnomer, because in my opinion it could be argued that it's made us feel more lonely. So I do sometimes play on my phone, and I've ignored somebody for 20 minutes, and I know that I've got friends that will give their phone to their child when they're shopping, who are sitting on an iPad watching a film walking around the supermarket. So I'm worrying now that whilst I do love my social media, that actually me sitting until 3 and 4 a.m. on the internet looking for my grandma's uncle's relatives, sisters, cousins, milkman, that basically maybe I should just go and chat to somebody and not feel so lonely. So these TV programs are promising us that we will have successful searching. So Who Do You Think You Are has got very famous people, and they go to lovely places, and we can see, it's always the Caribbean, beautiful places that we can visit. So Who Do You Think You Are has given us a lot of positivity and given us the idea of international travel. Long Lost Families is famous for reuniting adoptees, and one of the presenters is adopted, so it's close to his heart. And then something that I was involved with last year, the Genealogy Roadshow. So you know how you've got the Antiques Roadshow? People were encouraged to come along to beautiful buildings with something quirky from their ancestor, and basically you could show your great-grandma's photo or something, and somebody would attempt to answer some questions. They had some people that they'd already researched, obviously, for the programme. So genealogy is a very popular hobby. It used to be for the elite, but now it's for everybody. As a hobby, it's recorded as being second to gardening. And so physically, it's second to gardening as a hobby. And in the searching under genealogy websites, it's the second most visited after pornography. So if any of you were looking for a gap in the market, you could mix the pornography and genealogy angle, and you'd be making a fortune. So but I'm on commission if anybody does make their fortune with this gap in the market. However, genealogy is quite a reasonably priced hobby. If you do archery, you know, you've got to buy a £500 bow, and my daughter does gymnastics, and she has, in my opinion, £80 swimming costumes, you know. So genealogy is quite a reasonable hobby to pay for, because you've just got to pay for your membership fees and, you know, the certificates that you order. It's not actually an expensive hobby as hobbies go. It's estimated that in every family there is one person that's interested in family history. So if you've got parents with a few brothers and sisters who've got children, and you've got brothers and sisters that have got a few children, theoretically the average family has got about 40 people in it, and therefore if each family has got one person in it that is the family mine of information, you can call them a mine of information or gossip, you know. Basically, you've probably got a huge potential for people internationally. If 1 in 40 people is doing genealogy, that's actually a huge market that's available. You can consult other people in your family, so I ask questions to other people, but I still feel like it's my tree, and it's on Ancestry as my tree. So although I've picked all those people's brains and added some nice photos, it's still my hobby, but within my family, if heavens forbid anybody showed an interest, I could actually give them all that information. So DNA has added a whole new angle to our repertoire, and the internet has added up the potential for collaboration. I speak every week now to my Australian mine of information, and I speak about once a month to my American mines of information. So we can utilise records, combining civil records and censuses. So there's loads of things that we can physically do, and there are physical things that we can go and look for. We can go and look for records, archives, bits of paper, censuses, this kind of thing. But if we look at the psychology of this, then we have actually got tribes. So if I said to you, in a swimming pool, 1 of your children was drowning and 5 of somebody else's children were drowning, I think instinctively we'd save our children. So we are very tribal. And therefore, if you've got a tribe, there is a pecking order. So I do, with a snotty voice, say to my children sometimes, do you know who you're talking to? And therefore, in my family, I'm hopefully the head, and that the pecking order is that I'm above the children. And that, therefore, has given me some social identity. So when I was introduced, one of the things that was introduced by Sue was that I'm a lecturer. The other one was that I'm the mother of loads of children. So that gives me a social identity. The word mother has given me an identity. But who goes where in life's jigsaw? So in this jigsaw piece, people are shaking hands and collaborating. At work, there are hierarchies, so you can get a managerial family tree, and people have got pecking orders, and sometimes people aren't as nice as they should be at work. In this picture, you've got a group, and I'm not sure if they've excluded this person or whether they're trying to include. But as soon as you're in a group, you've got a we and us and me and them mentality. And if you're in a group, you can either bring this person in or you can push certain people out. So some of you might have left certain people off your tree. I've got friends that really don't speak to their sister anymore, and therefore she's not on their tree. Or you've got the most ridiculous tenuous links on your tree. So when do you stop being related? Is it second cousins? Is it sixth cousins? So because I'm adopted, as soon as I met some blood relatives who very randomly lived in the same city as me now, but that's another lecture, when we go out now, this is my cousin, and so I'm really excited with the label cousin because I haven't got any siblings. So how far do you go, and when does it start looking a bit silly, really? I decided that second cousin sounded silly at a party, so my new second cousins, I've introduced them as cousins. So if we look at the amount of people that we're searching for, when is it of interest and when does it become a bit silly? So for example, there's me, there's my two parents, although that's another lecture because obviously there's four. But anyway, the average person's having two parents. So if you've got two parents, you are 50% of each parent. So I was obviously a bit bored and lonely, and I spent ages doing all these figures. So basically, you've got yourself, two parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and then you start getting to the 10 generations ago. 10 generations didn't sound that long ago because we've quite often got 2 or 3 or even 4 generations alive at the same time. So I think 2, 3, 4 generations isn't much, and therefore 10 generations with a bit of paperwork is feasible. But actually, they share the tiniest amount of our DNA, and therefore, you might argue you're starting to be a bit silly now. Why are you going back this far? And the conundrum is that if you do go back through the generations, and you keep going back with your 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 to here, pretty soon it ends up at 1 million. So after 20 generations, in theory, because it doesn't work, but in theory, you've got over 1 million people after 20 generations. So if you think that 4 generations ago isn't that far away, 20 generations isn't a ridiculous amount away, is it? But it's actually 1 million people, which, as we know, it doesn't quite work like that, but theoretically it could. So, back to the psychology, how far back have you researched your family history? And if you've got clients or relatives or people that have asked you to help them, how far do they want you to go back? People always want you to go back, go back. Why don't you go sideways? Why is everybody so obsessed with going back? Oh, I'm back to 923 AD, and I think, crikey, why are you going back? Why don't you go sideways? Why don't you meet some of your second cousins? So in my adopted tree, I started to lose interest after I knew those people. So obviously I knew my parents, and obviously I knew my grandparents, but the next generation, I personally started losing interest in. Whereas with my biological tree, I'm clutching at straws and drowning in the swimming pool. Oh, give me some more relatives. So in my biological tree, I seem apparently to want to go back as far as possible. So I've got as far as the potato famine, and I'm really overjoyed with this layer of my history. And at the moment, that's an acceptable cutoff point for me. But in theory, I'd like to go back much further. And therefore, if you consider that the average person is having a baby 25 or 30, how many years is sufficient? Because if your parents are in their 30s, approximately, if you keep going back to this 1,000 people level, 1,000 people is 300 years ago. So when are you going to stop? So could you, just for 2 seconds, have a little think now? Why do you do family history? It's a group photo here of everybody in the room now. So I chatted at breakfast. It was a coincidence. We didn't come down together. The young man over there. Basically, he said that he got interested doing his family tree from when he was about 12 with grandparents. For me, I started my family tree because of photos. So if you have a little think, just for a couple of seconds, why did you start doing your family tree? And when did you start this journey? And philosophically, is it your hobby or is it actually your duty? I feel like it's my duty to tell my children these things. Don't you understand? You've come from the Irish potato famine, you know. And if they've done it at school, that's great. But basically, in my opinion, philosophically, it's really desperately urgent for some reason that my children know about all of this. When my mixed-race children did their DNA test and they completely know that their granddad is from Jamaica, they've got a really proud Jamaican heritage. They're so excited that they've got this Jamaican in them. And when their DNA came back as Ghanaian, they were broken because they had done slavery at school but hadn't completely connected it to their Jamaican ancestor. So sometimes the ancestry, the DNA results, can upset people. We'll have a look at that in a bit. So for you today, is it your hobby or is it your duty? If it's your duty, you need to start sharing your trees and you need to start collaborating much more. I've got so many people that I'm DNA related to who won't answer my questions politely as I word them and have got private trees. It's absolutely intriguing. So if somebody's been rude to you, obviously, you know, you can make your tree private. But if we're going to be trying to make our shared history, then perhaps we should open our trees up a bit more or answer some questions. I love this one. Don't let me be sitting next to the genealogist at the wedding. I went to one of my first funerals recently. It was my father-in-law's funeral, and I just must have looked like a crazy woman. I was just grabbing all these elderly women. Oh my God, I didn't know you were related to Felix. And they were like, who's this crazy woman? So I'm grabbing the funeral paper and filling them in on the funeral paper. How rude. But anyway. So if we're going to construct our ancestors' narratives, basically you could actually end up making a bit of a story up. So through my paper trail and my DNA test, it's come back that I am Irish heritage. So because my Irish ancestors left Ireland during the famine, I've stuck that in my story. So as far as I'm concerned now, they were diaspora from the Irish potato famine. They might have actually been really rich and gone on holiday and thought, we'll never go back again. Or, you know, a million other things could have happened, but I have taken the dates and my paper trail and stuck the little bit in that they were dispersing from the famine, and then I am running around giving lectures now on Irish diaspora and that I'm a descendant from the Irish potato famine. I've got no evidence of that at all, really, so I've made up that story. So if you have a look at your trees and think about some of the links that you've made with this person worked in the coal mine or this person did such and such a job, you've put all your implications into that narrative. So, because of our knowledge of history, physics, chemistry, travel routes, politics, society, medicine, occupations, I kind of know what a nurse does, and I kind of know what a coal miner does, and I kind of know where Cork is in Ireland, you know. So basically all the things that we kind of know, we're actually sticking into stories. They're not, you know, unless you're ridiculously lucky, none of us have got a diary from day one to day dot with their ancestors. So we're actually constructing narratives. And these narratives are fascinating and give us a snapshot of quite working class poor people as well. The language that we use can show our underlying feelings with genealogy, because genealogy looks at genes. Your family history is a narrative. Most of our metaphors are to do with trees, and trees have roots, and a tree without a root is a weed. I think there's a something like that anyway. And basically you can look at breeding. So some of the words have got to do with breeding and pedigrees. Pedigrees reminds me of horses. If we look at chains or links, the average man in here will say, my dad used to think this was a fantastic joke, if I'd have killed her on my wedding day, I'd have been out of prison by now. So is marriage a bond? Because in the animal kingdom, people don't get married, so we've invented marriage and we've invented faithfulness. Is it therefore a bond? Some people would say that they had got a rich tapestry to their history, and we've got the Bayer tapestry there, or we've got these little Russian dolls with loads of mini-me's there. And the way that you represent your information shows the psychology of your language as well. So, for example, if I was posh, I might have a coat of arms. So I'm not posh, so I have to have a tree, and I quite like the tree metaphor, until somebody spoke to me about pruning, which is excluding people that you don't like or including. As an adoptee, you can use a bow tie tree, and then I thought, that's fantastic, I'm going to use that, but my handwriting never goes that small, and I didn't know how to do it on a computer program. But in the ideal situation, that bow tree is nice, until somebody said to me, but you look like you're in the centre of a tug of war, Penny. You've got two families fighting over you. So in that sense, metaphorically, I have, because I think if those two women had ever met, it would have broken them. So I'm not 100% sure about the bow tie tree now. And I quite liked this one, which is basically your influencers. So I would really like to put my best friend on my tree, because I haven't got any siblings. And there's nowhere that's got a box that says best friend, so I can't put best friend on the tree. And I can't put my PhD supervisor. So, and if you are in the social care system, you obviously haven't got any parents. And therefore, in other trees like this, you can put down people that have influenced you during your life rather than relatives. So this is a quote from Michael Argyle, which I love. Family life takes place in the home and centres around eating, sleeping, child rearing, domestic jobs and leisure, blah, blah. And this is the bit that I like. There is almost no self-presentation and little restraint or affection or aggression. In other groups, members don't usually take off their clothes, laugh, cry, attack or kiss each other and crawl all over each other as family members do. So I thought that was a really nice quote about families. I've mentioned that our ancestors' story is ours and it becomes true, and you need to be careful of that, because I've got my story online, and if somebody didn't check it carefully, they might think it was true, but it's just evidence that I've collected. It's not necessarily true. I've really done my very best with it, but it's not necessarily true. And occasionally I get a polite person that says, my grandma is on your tree and she shouldn't be there, or, you know, there's polite ways of saying those things. So we've looked a little bit at fragmenting, and with me, for example, oh, there's a terrible error there. It says Penny Walters 1960s. Obviously, that's a terrible spelling mistake there. And when we're looking for relatives, we are quite often using sleuthing methods and detective work. And I do worry whether we're being really very intrusive and a bit too nosy. So even the language that we use, unearthing mysteries and tracing your ancestors, these are all quite detective work kind of things. And if anybody used all the methods that I've used for looking up ancestors, if they used those methods on me, I'd be pretty cross, really. So, why is it that we've got this kill and this instinct in us? So DNA testing has basically showed us how we are physically related to people. The ethnicity estimates can be very exciting, but can actually upset a lot of people as well. And my final few points is about ethics. What has ethics even got to do with genealogy? I'm only researching my family tree. What possible problems could there be? So we need to distinguish between ethics, which are principles, values, which are things that we value or admire, morals, which are standards of behaviour, and some people might abbreviate that to rights and wrongs, laws, there are laws with regards to ethical behaviours, or policies. And there are a million ethical dilemmas that have come up in genealogy that I've noticed over the years, and these are just some examples that I thought would be pertinent to this audience today. So, finding previously unknown information. There is a big dilemma as to whether or not to reveal people's family secrets, and many of you will have found that your great-grandma was 7 months pregnant when she got married, and who are you to be telling your granny? Oh, did you realise, the DNA results are opening up a major can of worms, as is ethnicity. Another ethical dilemma is, should you point out errors in trees to people? There's a lot of emotions here. We spoke earlier about elderly people really enjoying reminiscing, but actually when you're reminiscing with very elderly people, there might be some hideous stories in there as well. So, for example, my dad just did not want to talk about World War II, and maybe a very, very elderly lady in your family, maybe she was forced to give up her baby, and you giving her some jolly photos and reminiscing might be a romantic idea, actually, this reminiscing. I can really see the benefits. And finally, should women change their surname when they get married? What about same-sex couples? So if you've now got same-sex couples on trees, which surname would they get, or do they have a double-barreled one? This was an article which was in Family Tree magazine last month. If anybody was interested in this, you could research or ask Family Tree for a copy, or I can send it to you. I did a whole article on, I'm just researching my tree, what possible problems could there be? I probably haven't got time to go through this now, but I've mentioned the implications of heritage estimates, and people get very romantic with certain heritages. For example, I've got Native American Indian in me, I've got Irish, or it's Jamaican. So there's actually quite a romantic notion with some homelands. And when I say to some of my friends, I've got a friend who's got Hungarian ancestors. Oh, what did you think of Hungary then? Well, I've never been. So I said, you've never been? You've never been? Couldn't even catch my breath. So, is it a romantic idea that we look for ancestors? And is it a romantic thing that we're looking for heritages and homelands? So as professional genealogists, they're turning into tour guides now. We heard earlier about Americans going to Ireland looking for homelands and ancestral trails. Is it a bit romantic? Once you've got to your ancestor's house, what do you do? So with the Guild of One Name Studies, I was having a look from my angle, and my name, theoretically, is Penny Walters. Well, Penelope when I'm naughty, so Penelope Walters. So Walters is my dad's surname, and one of my children said, and he wasn't being horrible, he just said it, because two of my children have got my surname. They said, oh, we're not actually anything to do with the Walters family. And I thought, I hadn't thought of that actually. So I'm a Walters, but I haven't got anything physically to do with Walterses. Davis was my mother's maiden surname, and in my biological line, which I've researched from my DNA, I'm O'Neill, O'Reilly, Davis, those South Wales people, Rees, and if that chap that had given me those children had married me, I'd be an Allen. So basically, although I wouldn't want to change my surname, I do really like the Walters, and I've been Walters for 50 years, so I wouldn't want to change that. But anyway, so this is an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma for me would be, if I was doing a surname study with the Guild of One Name Studies, which surname would I choose? So I don't know whether to choose Walters, Davis, O'Neill, O'Reilly, and basically none of those are registered. So there's an opportunity for me to be even busier. But you can also do some quite quirky things with your searches. So, for example, Family Search sent me an email the other day. Dear Penny Walters, and it gave me some quirky information about the Walters surname. And I thought to myself, that's cute, because biologically I'm not a Walters. But anyway, it was cute. And with the Allen surname, the Allen one-name study was so excited to have black British people in their surname, because they'd traditionally only had Scottish heritage in the Allen surname. So in some senses, joining the one-name studies is really a good collaboration with the DNA testing. So, I've mentioned some adoptee ethical dilemmas. If anybody wanted the lecture, I'm a great believer in collaborating and not being territorial, apart from if my children are drowning, obviously. But basically, if anybody wanted either the presentation, you can email me, or, because obviously I'm an academic, I love I've got 8,000 books that I've referenced for every lecture. So if anybody wanted my references list, that would be fine. And if anybody wanted to stay in touch, then my email is there, and I think my card is on the table. And just to plug myself a little bit, there'll be a book available soon called Ethical Dilemmas in Genealogy, where I focus in on adoption issues, ethnicity issues, and diaspora issues. But the final chapter is the future of genealogy as well. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Penny. That was brilliant, as always. I'm quite interested, because I will reveal it here, I won't say who, but I have actually got evidence of an incest relationship in my family tree, and that has given me all sorts of ethical dilemmas in terms of who do I say, and also makes me very fearful about cousins who do a DNA test and what that might reveal. So it's a
that's
a very
absolutely fascinating example. Yeah. I've got a friend whose ancestor was the result of rape, and therefore, if you've then found that out, and it wasn't, there was no confusion, it was a forcible attack, do you then delete that person off your tree? They are biologically your father. So incest and rape and teenage, forced pregnancies are interesting dilemmas. Has anybody got any questions?
Any questions? Yes. Any questions? Anywhere?
Everybody looks a bit gobsmacked. Sorry.
Yeah. Is it that post-lunch? No, over here. Thank you.
I had a school friend. I had two school friends. One who was related to everybody in the history book, and the other one who was related to no one. She'd been adopted, but she could remember her father bringing her on a motorbike to Yorkshire. So much later on in life, after I got into family history, I said, would you like to find out who you are now? And she decided to wait until the adoptive parents had died.
Yeah,
and then we got her birth certificate. And then I went to work, and it was quite amusing, because the father, he was still alive, but he had by this time had 4 wives and 10 more children. I said, do you want to meet him? No, she said. That's one example.
Yeah, that's the thing. If before contraceptives were invented, basically you can, through DNA testing, find lots and lots of relatives. My biological tree, both sets of grandparents, they'd all had 10, 12 children, which is normal if you haven't got contraceptives. But what I found as an adoptee, whilst not having any siblings or biological parents, going through DNA testing back through time, I've got 1,000 people on my tree now, so it's really exciting. Yeah. Any other questions about the psychology? Why did you guys do your tree? Anybody got any questions about the psychology of doing your tree? Or has anybody got an ethical dilemma I can use as an example in the future? Yeah. The incest one was a good example. Oh, this young man.
Well, tell me how I should have responded to this then, Penny. I helped a friend at one point who was aiming to issue a little brochure about his family history. And the aim was to raise some money to put up a gravestone for some ancestor who didn't have one. So all the study was carried out, and towards the end, he circulated what we'd found to all the various living members of the family, and there was a serious objection from one lady who said, no, you can't put all of that, you can't publish it. Her reasoning was that she had been married 5 times and didn't want most of the family to know that. So how do you approach this?
I'm not here to give any advice. I'm here to raise psychological and philosophical questions. So
well,
the fascinating thing with psychology and philosophy is that there aren't any answers, because culturally you could have one answer, or, you know, so in my opinion, 5 husbands, what's the problem? But she must have been in a generation where that would have given some shame on the family. So this is where pruning would come in, you see. Well, so you might want to just add relatives that have given children.
There was a pragmatic resolution in that she'd had children by 3 of these marriages, so we missed out the other 2 marriages.
Yeah, we missed out the other 2. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I had a dilemma in as much as my grandmother was born in India, and she had always believed that her father had been killed in one of the Afghan skirmishes. When I got his army papers, because her mother had been married when she was 14 and a half, and my grandmother was born a year later, he then left his wife, who was 18, and his 3-year-old daughter in India. And that's a dilemma we've always thought, why? Did she not want to come back to England? Did he not love them anymore? Because I then found that he married, and is it bigamously or not, in Scotland, and had another 4 children. I actually put a little bit of that in. I didn't put the information up, I just put my grandmother's name up and the father and things. And it was on Genes Reunited for 4 or 5 years. And then I was contacted by someone who said, I think we're part of the same family, but who are you? And I said, well, when we meet, I will explain the situation. She was the granddaughter of the youngest son, the youngest brother, and my great-grandfather was the eldest brother. They knew nothing about the Indian family whatsoever. But what I found interesting is when I was searching his children, my grandmother's name was Gladys, and he named his youngest daughter from his second wife, Gladys.
And she probably didn't even realise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
When I first started contacting my relatives, because I started this malarkey when I was 15, I wrote to my mum's cousin in Canada with a series of questions, including about his mother's first marriage, which was why he was in Canada in the first place. And he came back to me saying, well, I didn't know she had a previous marriage, but what you've said explains a lot. So when I contacted my mother's cousin on the other side of the family, I didn't mention his father's first marriage, having been burnt once. And he came back to me saying, didn't you know? So I got it from both angles.
I'm always interested in hearing about people's ethical dilemmas, so obviously you can grab me in the breaks as well. And if anybody was overjoyed with the talk, I can send you the presentation or a summary, because some people take notes, but sometimes it's nice to have the summary or the presentation. So people can email and stay in touch.
Well, can we just say thank you to Penny one more time, and put our hands together and thank her for a great talk. as she says, she is around the whole weekend, so over dinner tonight, lots of opportunity to discuss ethical dilemmas, I feel.